One of the things that I have found confusing over the course of my journey of faith is that there are beliefs that I thought I had rejected only to find myself starting to believe in them again. Things that I thought could be rationally explained away as mythological projections from long gone ages of superstition and primitive thinking. Things like angels and the devil. I've long been wary of simplistic spiritualized explanations for things that can be more naturally explained. So phrases like "the devil made me do it" have always brought skepticism rising up in me if they are expressed in seriousness, derision even. I've seen it as a cop-out by people who don't have the guts to take responsibility for their own actions. In my previous job decades ago, I used to work with a lot of people with serious and often out of control mental illnesses. And one of the common symptoms was religious delusions. And I remember constantly being told that the devil had tripped someone over in the street, or a demon had made someone lose $10, or Satan had knocked a coffee cup out of someone's hand. This sort of stuff made me more and more convinced that the devil was basically just a psychosocial projection for people who habitually look for someone else to blame. And even if he wasn't, the devil, unlike God, cannot be in all places at once. And I was pretty sure that wandering around my neighborhood tripping over harmless people was not high on the devil's list of strategies for undermining the work of God. But over the years, I have increasingly found myself believing in the existence of the devil again. I'm not saying that I believe there's a little red man with forked tail and horns, and in fact, the Bible never describes him that way anyway. I'm not even sure whether I really believe that there's one being, one individual who is called the devil or the Satan, but I'm finding it increasingly easy and even helpful to imagine it that way. The reason is that I'm more and more convinced that there are powers of evil that are not just the sum of our own human flaws, prides, hostilities, and selfishness. They're not just the results of bad toilet training, absent fathers, and childhood trauma. Not that those things aren't bad enough. The damage done in childhood can continue to have very destructive and tragic consequences right the way through a lifetime. But the further I go on my journey, the more I see things in myself, in the church, and on the national or global stage that just do not seem to be explainable in terms of simple consequences of past hurts. Some things seem to defy comprehension unless there are forces of cosmic evil that are bigger and stronger and far more systematically organized than our assorted human weaknesses could ever be. And I'm increasingly convinced that to try and explain them in simple psychosocial terms actually leaves us more vulnerable to them than we are if we're able to give them a name, an identity. It kind of has a focus for our opposition and resistance. John Levison raised the question of whether Dietrich Bonhoeffer could have been half as clear and courageous in his resistance to the Nazis if he had believed that Hitler and his followers were just the unknowing victims of inner psychological traumas. Because no, Bonhoeffer saw evil as having a face, having a name, and therefore being something that could be unmasked, denounced, and resisted. So perhaps belief in the devil may actually inspire deeds of heroic good and not just be a way to cop out of responsibility. You see, one of the ways that evil hides itself so effectively is by never having a face or a name. And you can see this whenever there's a campaign about some clear evil in the world of business or politics. We might be campaigning against the release of toxins into the river, or against the continuing obscenity of deaths in custody, or against the mounting pressure on people to work longer and longer hours unpaid and neglect their families. And what's the biggest obstacle to any such campaign? Every time it's the same thing: an inability to identify where the buck stops, who is responsible. The further you chase the lines of responsibility, the more they just get blurry and indistinct and impersonal. Everyone and everything and every decision seems to be a helpless victim of market forces or global trends or economic imperatives. You try to find where the buck stops, and it not only doesn't stop, it vanishes in the haze. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that saying the buck stops with the Satan is going to make one iota of difference in such situations, although being able to name a situation as demonic can have an impact. What I am saying is that when evil wants to get its own way, it usually becomes nameless and faceless. And in doing so, it disarms many of those who would oppose it because they've got nowhere to aim. And I'm increasingly convinced that people like me, who have been so intellectually clever and rationalist in our explanations for everything, have actually played right into the devil's hands by allowing him to conceal himself behind our theories of primitive myth and superstition and psychological projection. This is true whether you're trying to fight the forces of racism and genocidal politics, or whether you're just trying to dislodge blockages in your own prayer life. Let me illustrate one of that latter kind from my own experience. Way back when I first began committing myself to a regular discipline of daily prayer, I noticed some strange reactions within myself. First, there was just the resistance that I had always had to any form of discipline, but I managed for the first time in my life to persevere beyond that, to break through that barrier. And when I got beyond that, all sorts of things began to go haywire in my life. And pretty much all of them are things that I would still see primarily in terms of my own psychological baggage. Basically, my inner shit was coming to the surface because in the silence it had space to do so. But then as I began to cope with that, some things began to happen that felt much more like there were conscious spiritual forces involved seeking to derail the train before my journey went too far. I started finding appetites growing for things that pulled me in the opposite direction. For example, I started feeling a pull towards sleazy pornography that I hadn't really experienced since I was a hormone-infested 19-year-old. And there didn't seem to be anything else going on in my life at the time to suggest that it was simply drawing on unresolved issues in my psyche or messy problems in my relationships. Rather, it was as though the opposition had conceded that I was going to pray. So the next best strategy was to try and counterbalance the impact of that. Meet an increase in prayer with an increase in sleaze, and at the end of the day, the balance is roughly the same as it always was. Back then, although the internet was quite new, porn was suddenly far more accessible than it had been when I was 19 too. So in the face of a struggle like that, it can make all the difference in the world whether you see the temptations as manifestations of some kind of evil or simply a quirky flaw of your own psychology. If I see it as simply a little maladjustment due to rejection in early puberty or something, then it's no big deal. I can deal with it tomorrow or in 6 months or just learn to live with it. We're all broken, all saved by grace alone. We all have our faults and foibles. But if I recognize that this is actually a stage in a concerted, organized, and systematic campaign to subvert the work of Christ in and through me, then the situation is very different. The stakes are suddenly a whole lot higher. It makes a real difference whether I confront this head on now or just adapt to it and don't worry about it too much. Now, please don't take from my illustration the idea that all sinful temptation is about sex. It's certainly not. But along with money and power, sex is one of the big three. Sex is the easiest to illustrate, but money and power probably shipwreck more Christian lives. And power certainly shipwrecks more pastors' lives. In every church, there are plenty of people who at some stage in their journey have faced some crisis questions about how they will handle money, sex, or power in their lives. And partly because they've failed to see it in the context of a kind of demonic strategy to derail their discipleship, they've made some significant compromise and just adapted to living with an area of their life running on different values to the rest. It's the beginning of fragmentation, of disintegration. It's no accident that the words integration and integrity are almost the same. One fatal compromise that you refuse to revisit, to reevaluate, one little thing that you hang on to. If the devil can get you once and then persuade you to ignore the resulting wound, the infection will slowly kill you, and he'll never have to worry about you again. If you never feel attacked by the forces of evil, it's probably because you never cause him any trouble, so why would he bother? If you prefer to think that it's because you're of such high spiritual caliber, then you need to explain today's gospel reading for us, because Jesus experienced the attacks of the devil very clearly. It's interesting to note that of the big three, money, sex, and power, it is predominantly power that the devil tries to get at Jesus with. This is no surprise because it's undoubtedly the most subtle and most potent of the three. And according to the other version of this story in Luke's gospel, the Satan does not concede defeat at the end. He just departs from Jesus until an opportune time. He's just biding his time, lying in wait. So, whether it's helpful to you to think of evil forces as being personified in an individual, the Satan, or just as dark, nebulous forces, what the gospel story makes clear is that the cosmic resistance to Jesus and to the work of Jesus was organized, subtle, and genuinely threatening, capable even of appearing as an angel of light quoting scripture. But before you lose hope in the face of all this, let me point out what is on our side. Firstly, the devil can't make you do anything. I still believe that anyone who says the devil made me do it is copping out. The devil can tempt you, lure you, seek to distract you, try to confuse you, all sorts of things. But the devil can't make you do anything. Whatever the devil does, you still have sole choice and control over your own actions. Secondly, we are made in the image of God, and that includes having a natural instinct for goodness and being able to tell the difference. And not only are we God's image bearers, we are redeemed image bearers who in our relationship with the Spirit of God have available to us more than enough wisdom, courage, and strength to discern and resist whatever the devil can throw at us. Thirdly, we do not usually have to face evil alone the way Jesus did in the wilderness. We are called together into a community of redeemed people. And so we can pool both our wisdom and our strength. And as a community, be much more capable of discerning and overcoming the threats to our well-being. And finally, we know we are on the winning side. We know that in Jesus the Christ, the powers of evil are defeated, and that all that is left is a kind of rearguard guerrilla action that is yet to be fully mopped up. And in that knowledge, even when the opposition is at its fiercest, we know that if we can just hang on and hold our ground, that will be enough, because they're running out of resources. This season of Lent teaches us a lot about just hanging on, about gritting our teeth and resisting the forces of evil. But paradoxically, one of the resources that we have to sustain us in that is the spirit of celebration, celebrating the victory that we know is won, but which we are so far experiencing only in part. That's why we come each week to the Lord's table, to celebrate what has been accomplished and to be sustained for the remaining struggle until all things are brought to fulfillment.